Let's take a look at disability from an employment law perspective. The definition of disability under the ADA includes the following: a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, a record of having such an impairment, or being regarded as having such an impairment. An employee is protected under the ADA if they meet any of the three criteria. There's no protection for non-disabled persons who are discriminated against because of their association with disabled persons. Although this definition appears broad, plaintiffs have difficulty getting past the threshold issue. Prior to the enactment of the ADA Amendments Act, the ADAAA, in 2008, courts found many plaintiffs to not be disabled despite their epilepsy, diabetes, depression, and a host of other conditions typically viewed as disabilities. In amending the ADA, Congress declared that the definition of disability under the ADA shall be construed in favor of a broad coverage of individuals under the Act. However, although the ADA Amendments Act makes it easier to prove a disability, it does not absolve a party from proving one. Both physical and mental impairments are incorporated into the definition of disability. It's critical to realize that not all serious health problems meet the legal definition of disability. The definition of disability is based on an individualized assessment of the effects of health problems on a person's functioning rather than on a diagnostic label. Although the ADA does not list specific impairments that are considered disabilities, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has identified impairments that should easily qualify as disabilities, though the list is not exhaustive. Physical disorders like deafness and blindness, neurological conditions like autism and cerebral palsy, psychological disorders like bipolar or schizophrenia, and other conditions like cancer, muscular dystrophy, diabetes, and depression. The list is not exhaustive. Many other types of impairments can be disabilities. Certain conditions or behaviors are expressly excluded from the definition as well. Significantly, persons who are current users of illegal drugs, regardless of whether they suffer from drug addiction, are not considered disabled under the ADA. However, those undergoing rehabilitation for drug addiction and are not currently using illegal drugs are protected by the ADA. To be considered a disability, a physical or mental impairment must substantially limit an individual in the performance of one or more major life activities. Major life activities include, but are not limited to, caring for oneself, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, sitting, reaching, lifting, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, and communicating. The third component of the definition of disability is that the individual must be substantially limited, but not necessarily completely unable in the performance of a major life activity. The central issue is whether, compared to most people in the general population, the individual's impairment substantially limits the conditions, manner, or amount of time it takes to perform a major life activity. The focus is on how tasks are performed rather than on which outcomes the individual manages to achieve. Disabilities are often long-standing conditions or expected to have a long-term impact on functioning rather than acute injuries expected to heal relatively quickly. However, a condition that is episodic, that flares up unexpectedly, or is in remission still continues to be a disability if it would substantially limit a major life activity when active. Importantly, the determination of whether an impairment is substantially limiting must be made without regard to the effects of mitigating measures. Supports that disabled persons use to manage their disabilities include things like medications, prosthetic devices, hearing aids, implants, mobility devices, oxygen therapy, equipment, and learned behavioral adaptation. The assessment of whether an impairment is substantially limiting must be based on the nature of the underlying condition rather than on how well the person is able to cope despite their condition. Mitigating measures do not include ordinary eyeglasses or contact lenses intended to fully correct visual activity.